Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. They are Daniel Gallen and Tyler Calvaruso. And as promised, we've got part two of our roster breakdown that we started this week for you folks at lions247.com here on the podcast. On Tuesday, if you missed our episode that dropped then, we went position by position on defense, looking at the transfer portal's impact in terms of guys who are coming on board for Penn State. I'm sorry, offense last episode in terms of guys who are coming on board, guys who are leaving campus, and players who are staying on campus, which is a really important piece of this puzzle as well. This time around, we're flipping the script. We're going to talk about defense. We're going to go through the defensive end, defensive tackle, linebackers, safeties, cornerbacks. A lot is happening. There are 30 or so moves so far, players coming in, more than that, players going out, and those numbers will probably continue to build as we are just halfway through the transfer portal window here in January. That goes from the 2nd through the 16th. We're on Friday, January 9th right now, and Tyler and Daniel, I know you've both been working really hard throughout this entire run of changes for Penn State regarding the 2026 roster. It's been tough to cover, and it got a little bit more difficult this week, Daniel, because we had some reversals of decisions. We'll get to one on the defensive side of the football a little bit later, but let's begin at wide receiver, where Tyseer Denmark, who will be a redshirt sophomore in 2026, guy that we all really liked coming in as a prospect. We thought he had a chance to really make some moves in the offense this past season. That did not ultimately happen. He put it out there that he was going to be staying here at Penn State early on in the transfer portal window. Now he is moving on from Penn State. His name is in the transfer portal.
Yeah, I think that that's just an example of how fluid these situations are right now. And also I think the overall roster uncertainty that you get when you have a coaching change with someone who's coming in and turning things over. I think even before, in the process of when Denmark said he was coming back and when he said he was leaving, that wide receiver room changed drastically. I think Iowa State, 4 of their receivers are coming over, including their top 2 pass catchers from a year ago. That picture is changing. These rosters are, changing every day. And, if you're not necessarily one of those like top line, high priority guys that you want to get back, things can be a little uncertain. The ground can shift a little bit. And so I know that there's a certain segment, of the fan base that, is very, surprised, maybe, guys going back on their word, things being framed like that. I think that when it gets down to it, you do have to look out for yourself in some of these situations. If things change, if your situation changes, you have to go find a better one. And that's just the nature of the portal right now. These 2 weeks, I think that there's a reason why, when we write these stories, a lot of times the language is pretty couched. Denmark wasn't one of the guys who put out like the graphic that explicitly said, I am coming back to play football for Penn State in 2026. He was one of the ones that you say like, well, he wrote this, he put the picture up, the guys or other players responded to it in a way. You can take this as an indication. I think that's the word I've really been, harping on, because these things do change. I mean, it's a little bit of a different example, but like, JB Nelson last year, in January, he comes out and says, I will be back next year. And then spring transfer portal window, he's on the move. It's just, these situations are so fluid right now. And, I think that this is just the nature of it now. I do think that this offseason is going to be a little anomalous for Penn State just because of the coaching change. I think you look at Matt Campbell, the culture he built at Iowa State, and that he's importing over to Happy Valley. I don't think you'll see, wholesale changes every offseason like you see at other programs. But this is just, I think, like the cost of doing business right now. This is what, having a coaching change in 2026 college football means. But yeah, I mean, I do think that we were excited to see what Tyseer Denmark could do. We're well documented. We were really high on him. I think the idea of him working with Noah Pauley with his track record, really intriguing what he could do. But, the way that these things goes, there's a lot of different interests involved. And, when it comes down to it, Penn State and Matt Campbell, they have to do what's best for them. Tyseer Denmark needs to do what's best for him.
We've discussed the potential versus production conversation as Penn State has gone through the process of rebuilding this roster under new leadership. And you're still in the potential phase for Tyseer Denmark. Only 4 career catches, 45 yards, one touchdown that came on the final play of the 2024 regular season. And he actually played more snaps as a true freshman, 43 of them at receiver, than he did as a redshirt freshman, just 28 snaps on the season in 2025. So he will look for a fresh start. We broke down the receiver spot quite a bit on our last episode of this podcast. As I mentioned, that dropped on Tuesday. But staying at receiver for one more name, Tyler, shifting over to Matt Outen. He's a guy that was a really important pickup for former receivers coach Marcus Hagans and Penn State's staff a couple summers ago after he initially committed to Virginia Tech. Now you got to wonder if he ends up circling back to Virginia Tech with the familiarity there with some of the staff members. But Outen is a member of this 2025 freshman class who has put his name into the transfer portal. Didn't get involved in game days this past season, but he is somebody that the athletic ability has been very apparent for a long time. And he's one of those guys that you talk about the eyeball test. As soon as he showed up to campus, you knew that Matt Outen was on the practice field. Now he's no longer part of the future at receiver with 4 years of eligibility ahead of him, a former top 24/7 prospect.
Yeah, it has all the traits to be a successful power forward receiver. It just really didn't come together for him at Penn State. And from a timing perspective, right out the door after just 1 year, his best ball is definitely ahead of him. I don't think he enters the portal unless Virginia Tech is the spot for him, to be completely honest. I think that's where he ultimately lands. When it's all said and done, I mean, Virginia Tech is a program he was committed to at one point as well. So I think it's clear that he's a James Franklin guy, buys into what he's selling down in Blacksburg. So we'll see where that thing goes. But when it comes to Penn State's receiver room, it's another talented young wideout out the door. A guy you probably would have liked to keep. But again, there are conversations taking place behind the scenes. Some of these guys were making X amount of money with the previous staff. New staff comes in. Where do they deem that valuation? Is it what the player wants, or is it not what the player wants? If it's not what the player wants, that's why I think you're seeing some departures a little bit later in the portal cycle. Those conversations are taking place. Guys aren't getting the number that they might have been anticipating they were going to get. It's not where it is in comparison to where it was with the previous staff. So there's a bunch that goes into it. I'm not saying that's why Matt Allen's out the door. I think Virginia Tech.
Tyler, can we clarify? Yeah. Can we clarify that a little bit? Because I feel like some people that are watching and listening to this conversation might think, "Oh my gosh, so Penn State has less of a bankroll than they did last year. Is the financial stuff an issue NIL wise?" I think we're looking at really a new set of eyeballs, many sets of eyeballs actually, with Matt Campbell, all the people he brought in from the coaching staff and the personnel department, and also a different way of maybe allocating that NIL money. The overall number could be similar, but how you spread it across your entire roster could look very different. And as we've talked about in the recent months, the amount of money that some of the backups and seldom used offensive and defensive pieces were getting from Penn State and the NIL money last season really doesn't align perhaps with what you want to accomplish moving forward and what you may be looking to do moving forward. So that could impact some of the lower rung of the ladder deep depth chart guys like a Matt Outen, like a Tyseer Denmark, when they're trying to evaluate what their financial outlook is for the next season.
Yeah, it's not a matter of not having the funds. It's a matter of whether or not the price tag is inflated, in the opinion of the new Penn State staff. It's a different staff. It's a different philosophy. So some guys are going to be valued higher than others. Some guys are going to be valued lower than others. That's just kind of the name of the game at this point, because every staff is going to have a different opinion on a kid compared to a different staff. And that's why you've seen some overturn, just differing opinions. And they're going to put their money elsewhere. That's why you've seen them be so active in the portal at certain positions. It's all relative in the context of the roster building plan. Where do you want to spend your money? Which position groups do you really want to harp on improving? You're kind of seeing where the money's going based on the portal pursuits and some of the guys going out the door. And again, a lot of those former Iowa State guys, they are coming over with the expectation to contribute, not just in year one. We're expecting plenty of them to contribute in year one, but there are plenty of guys who are coming over from Iowa State who are anticipated to contribute down the road. So again, it's all relative in the context of numbers, roster building philosophy, and valuations, because that's the name of the game at the end of the day. If this staff decides this kid's not worth X number of dollars, they're not going to pay him. They're going to move on, and they're going to find someone else that they feel can fill that void at the price they feel is appropriate for that player's skill level and talent. So it's a layer of roster building in college football that I guess it's commonplace now. I guess that's just the way things work. That's the way we're going to be looking at things from here on out. And it's new for us because, we got so accustomed to a certain structure and certain philosophy and certain approach in the portal and approach to roster building with James Franklin, Andy Frank, all those guys. So it's definitely a different kind of vibe now, different kind of philosophy and approach, but it's one that I think is working for this Penn State staff right away.
And we've already seen Jeff Exeter Jr., by the way, jump over to Virginia Tech. He was another one of those young wide receivers that we didn't really get a chance to see in game action as a Nittany Lion. He has found a home with the Hokies. We'll see if that ultimately is the case for Matt Outen as well, who's a Virginia native. We are going to get to a lot on the defense in just a moment, but it has been a busy few days for Penn State's running back room. We'll talk about a leadership change in just a moment as they have determined their next coach for that position group. But in terms of personnel, Daniel, we got some clarity that we did not have early in the week when we were working through our position groups for offensive conversation for Tuesday's episode. We did not yet have anything out there publicly from Jabri Coleman and Tyke Hayes, two guys that were part of that 2025 freshman class for Penn State. Two new running backs to the room, did not see game action through the regular season. You saw Hayes get a few carries in the Pinstripe Bowl as a backup. Hayes declaring that he will remain on campus in State College. Jabri Coleman going to the transfer portal. So they kind of split up here. I'm curious to see what the new running backs coach maybe thinks about Jabri Coleman. Is he somebody that he wants to kind of get back into this class? But as of right now, a couple Philadelphia products in Tysier Denmark and Jabri Coleman exploring other options. But I think what overshadows Coleman leaving to me, Daniel, is Tyke Hayes staying. This is no slight to Jabri Coleman, but Hayes was the running back that I think all three of us were higher on going into preseason camp last year. Part of that was because Tyke Hayes had spring ball under his belt. Jabri Coleman was a summer enrollee. But I think overall the physical ability that Tyke Hayes possesses, he looked different than anybody else in that room when he showed up to campus. His length, his build, big lower body that you can build on that base, and also a guy that we've heard has some fearless tendencies at the running back position. We've even seen a little bit of that here and there in some game action. Daniel, what do you make of these movements for the lower tier of the running back room? Maybe guys that we weren't circling as huge impact players in 2026, but you need depth. And who knows? You never know what running back could break out at the right moment for you and kind of carry your offense. And so I think it's worth analyzing all the way through, even if these guys aren't at the front of the conversation right now.
Yeah, I think Penn State getting Tyke Hayes back is a pretty big deal. Western Pennsylvania guy from Aliquippa. He's someone that, like you said, it was pretty much from the jump. Like he got to campus, the feedback was good. It stayed good individually, throughout the course of the year. We know that overall, the feedback on non-Singleton, non-Katron Allen running backs overall was not good from Stan Drayton, and that was really borne out by the playing time that those other running backs got during Big Ten play, which was none. But I think you're bringing back Hayes, and I think that this is someone that you have high upside. You've made additions to the room through the portal with Carson Hansen, with James Peoples. Those are older guys, and running back is one of those positions where you need to have depth up and down. You need to have depth up and down in terms of classes. You need to be developing guys because you never know that nature of that position when someone is going to need to step in. I liked what we saw in that little glimpse of Hayes in the Pinstripe Bowl. It was kind of nice to finally see it after hearing a lot about it and having it being teased and never actually seeing it. I think that there's something there. I'm curious what the next steps in his development look like. I'm curious what the playing time breakdown might look like moving forward. But I think getting Hayes back, in-state kid, someone where the arrow does seem to be pointing up, is a real positive for the staff. With Jabri Coleman, he's someone that it was just I think a bit of a tough situation when coming in as a summer enrollee, and we talked about how just deep that room was. And so you're starting at, what was it, like number 6 or number 7, like off from the jump. It was always going to be a little bit of an uphill climb. I thought we got really good insight on him from Stan Drayton once Coleman got to campus, the type of running back he could be, where his upside might be. I think it'll be really interesting to see potentially where he could land, how things could work out for him in the portal, because he was committed to Georgia at one time. Penn State, I think, stayed on him. They wanted to bring him into the fold. And we know how discerning of an eye Jaywan Sider had, as a recruiter. So I think that there is something there. It's just a question of maybe where Jabri Coleman will realize it at this point.
Coleman's a guy that, you look at his trajectory early on in high school, committed to Georgia, as you said, someone who was really highly regarded. gone down a little bit in terms of that brand, because he ended up being like a 3-star prospect in our rankings at 24/7 Sports, signed with Penn State, didn't do anything as a freshman in game action. And now you're kind of wondering, okay, what's next for him? What can he become? A couple programs that Brian Doan reports are involved with him are Auburn and West Virginia. So we'll see what the market looks like for Jabri Coleman. By the way, this popped up. Former Penn State running back London Montgomery resurfaced at the Power 4 conference level. He is committed to the Florida Gators, spent a couple seasons with East Carolina after taking a red shirt with Penn State, a former in-state running back recruit, passing that along. Daniel mentioned James Peoples. Tyler, you talked about James Peoples a bit earlier this week because he was visiting campus. Since we last spoke here on the podcast, Peoples has delivered a commitment to Penn State. He will be part of the 2026 plan at running back. He's a former top 24/7 prospect who went to Ohio State for a couple of seasons. This year, 344 rushing yards, 3 touchdowns. He averaged 5.5 yards per carry. It was his most productive season as a Buckeye. He had about 50 carries for 200 yards a year earlier as a freshman. But with 2 years of eligibility, the thing I am hearing out of Columbus here, where they're now wondering if Bo Jackson might enter the portal, their emerging freshman standout, because he may have some financial demands. Whether or not that happens, I don't know. But it sounds like regardless, in Columbus, this one stung a little bit for the Buckeyes in terms of a guy that they would have preferred to have kept around as part of their running back approach in 2026. And it makes me wonder what his role has been sold as at Penn State, because as Daniel referenced there, and as we discussed earlier in the week, you've already got a former Iowa State standout and Carson Hansen committed to 2026 plans. He was the lead rusher for the Cyclones last season with this same staff. We talk about Hayes coming back. He's not even the most prominent in-house retention. That's Quentin Martin Jr., who's coming off a 100-yard rushing game in the Pinstripe Bowl. So, Tyler, what can you kind of lay out for us for why this makes sense for Penn State, for Peoples, and what he might be able to accomplish in a different uniform as a junior? And you're muted.
Sorry, guys. You look at Iowa State's offense, it's an offense that's predicated on 2 backs succeeding. I mean, it wasn't just Carson Hansen shouldering the load out of the backfield for Iowa State in 2025. They got their other backs involved as well. So I think people slots in pretty nicely. There's the chance for him to take on a larger workload. And there are people who are very confident in his ability to succeed in a larger workload. There are people in Columbus who thought that larger workload should have come in 2025. He flashed his potential on several occasions throughout the year. UCLA, he had a really, really good game. I believe it was a multi-touchdown performance. Garnered some really positive praise from Ryan Day and other members of the staff. He's a good player. Former blue chip recruit. He's ranked just ahead of Quentin Martin over on our side. He's the number 7 running back in Quentin Martin's class. Quentin Martin was number 8. Those two have a little bit of familiarity. So all these guys are going to get the chance to duke it out for carries, and they're still in the market for another back as well. So it's about stockpiling top tier talent at the position. That's the philosophy in running back recruiting at the portal for this Penn State staff, and Peoples fits that bill. I mean, there are some people in coaching circles, agent circles who were surprised to see Peoples pop while he was on campus. His market was so robust that the anticipation was he was going to take visits elsewhere, but this staff was able to close. And there's a lot of dialogue on social media on the board about, oh, well, where is the splash get of the portal season going to come for this Penn State staff? A guy like Peoples can be viewed as a splash get when you think about what his market was looking like and this staff's ability to go out, close, and get Peoples on board. He's going to be a key part of this running back room in 2026. There's no doubt about it.
Unless my math is wrong here, I think Penn State in the last week doubled up its transfer total at running back from what it had done in the entire portal existence. I believe John Lovett, coming up from Baylor back in 2021, is the only example of this position getting a player out of the portal. If I'm wrong, I am wrong. Trey Potts. So they matched it. Trey Potts out of Minnesota. There's all these names from the last decade floating in my mind, and the transfer portal chaos doesn't help. But yeah, they've matched that, which I think you're seeing them get 2 quarterbacks transferred. They had never had a transfer quarterback. You're seeing the results here of a team that is in transition, a coaching staff that is in transition, and we're all trying to keep up with the process. And one of the names that has been part of that process as well is Deontay Sheffy. We heard from Daniel Gallen earlier this week on Sheffy, a guy he got a chance to watch in some game action at State College High School this season. We have all seen him in prospect camp action repeatedly over the last couple of years. The last staff did not offer a scholarship offer. He spent considerable time committed to Syracuse But the in-town standout, we don't say this often, is committed to Penn State on a scholarship, and this has not happened for a State College high school player since Keaton Ellis, a cornerback in the 2019 recruiting class. They've had guys walk on from that program, the Little Lions over there, just a mile or so away from Beaver Stadium. But this is a guy that they determined needed to be a fit for them here in January. They get it done. Tyler, quickly, because we covered a lot of ground on him earlier this week, what does Sheffy bring to the class, and what are your personal expectations for him making this move? Is he a guy that we pretty much need to let get to campus, do his thing behind the scenes in 2026, and then see what happens beyond that? Because I'm not getting the indication that Penn State's going to count on him to go and push the guys we've already discussed for meaningful reps game one.
No, and I don't think anyone should have that expectation. I don't think they have that expectation internally. You file him away, you see where he's at in his development a year from now, 2 years from now. He's a good player. I mean, I think it's an evident example of the recruiting philosophy, production, potential. It's a mixture of the both here. In this take late in the cycle, Missouri was pushing to get Sheffy on campus for a visit. He was actually supposed to be there this weekend. He's not going to be making that trip now. Obviously, Penn State offered last week, moved quickly to get him on campus, got this one wrapped up within 24 hours of his arrival. Short little trip for him over to Penn State, and it went well for all parties involved. Everyone's comfortable with where Sheffy's at in his development. They think he could be a guy down the road. Sheffy's probably never going to be one of those running backs who pops off the page from a measurable or a testing perspective. I think that's just not who he is. I don't know what's going to happen when he gets a college strength and conditioning program in the works. I think that could alter his athletic profile, maybe alter the upside as well. I think it's a solid ceiling here for Deontay Sheffy, and I think it's a solid floor as well. So we'll see in a year or two. Again, no one's expecting Deontay Sheffy to come in day one and challenge for serious carries in this backfield. They're going to monitor his development. He's going to get to work with Penn State staff, with the new running backs coach hire, whose name I don't want to drop yet because I think we were planning on talking about him a little bit later. But I think the tools are there for something to be built upon with Deontay Sheffy. I think there's a foundation in place. That's why I like the floor and I like the ceiling as well.
He's just one of those players that when you watch him play football, whether it's a 7-on-7 setting or in the pads, it translates better than when you look at the measurements, look at those test numbers, like you said. When you take the scouting combine approach versus what do you have in front of you with the football in his hands, different kind of conversation. And I think Sheffy has a real natural feel for the running back position based on what we have seen. He ultimately replaces Messiah Mickens in this class. Mickens was long committed to the 2026 class as a running back out of Harrisburg High School. He has since shifted his plans over to Virginia Tech and James Franklin for his future. But those two shared a backfield. 2 years ago at Harrisburg, Sheffy spent one season with Harrisburg, then came back to State College for his senior season. And all he did with that opportunity was go for 1,600 rushing yards, went over 100 yards in 10 of State College's 12 matchups as a senior. So he'll be on campus down the road. A lot brewing in the running back room, and they've got a new leader to help them put that together. It's Savon Huggins, as we reported on Thursday evening at Lions 24/7 in collaboration with Matt Zenitz and Chris Hummer from our 24/7 Sports, CBS Sports Network. Huggins is the pick here for Matt Campbell and the staff. He completes the position coach staff as we have come to kind of see the Iowa State movement, and then we've seen different pieces from different places, UCLA, USC, and now Boston College, where he's been for the last several years. Huggins is a former top prospect. He was one of the premier players in the Northeast in the 2011 recruiting class, ended up signing with Rutgers, was a huge signing for the Scarlet Knights at that point. Never really lived up to those lofty expectations in Piscataway, was well-liked on that campus, but as a player, the production wasn't there. He finished his career at Northern Iowa, but he has quickly become a standout in the coaching ranks. And Tyler, you have some history covering Boston College. I believe that crossed paths early with him. So we'll get to you in a moment on Savon Huggins. But Daniel, what stood out to you immediately as we were sorting through this news and preparing to break it on Thursday? And now that you've had a chance to kind of acknowledge who is the running backs coach, what do you think this move signals perhaps to what Penn State wants to do in that room?
Well, as I was doing my research on Savon Huggins, I found some old Tyler Calvaruso bylines on our Boston College site, which helped that process along pretty well. Now, I think this is a solid hire. I think that it fits in with the profile of the other coaches that Matt Campbell has hired, where you've got these younger guys, Savon Huggins, class of 2011, younger than me, like a year after me in high school. Like I made the joke to you guys where when we auto tag everyone in our, in stories, all these guys are popping up with their player profiles, not their coach profiles, because a lot of these guys, they did play major college football. They were on the 24/7 sports radar. Like they are, guys who were commodities when they played the game and are now early in their coaching careers and getting these big opportunities. I think that with Huggins, it's like the thing that stood out to me was looking at those numbers at Boston College, where maybe not this past year, even though he did a great job with Turbo Richard, and what they were able to do with him. He's at Indiana now. If Indiana is coming calling for your guy in the transfer portal, you must be doing something right with him. He must be a pretty good player. Just kind of a crazy thing to say at this point. But yeah, I think the overall output of that Boston College running game, while Huggins was there, I know that they got some help from Thomas Castellanos in one of those years and what he was able to do as a dual threat. But they were up near the top of the ACC in rushing. They had productive guys. They had multiple running backs who were carrying the load there. And so that really stood out to me, is that he's someone who, maybe Boston College isn't working in the most prominent spotlight. Maybe he is a little bit under the radar. I think that was apparent in some of the reaction on our board and on social media, when the hire was made, especially considering some of the other names that were floated out there during the process. But I think that this just fits really nicely with how Matt Campbell is putting his staff together, the type of coaches he's looking for. And I think that's a philosophy that's worked out for Matt Campbell when you look at his success at Iowa State. So we'll see. I am excited to see how this running back room comes together, continues to come together. And it seems like you have a very young, dynamic leader who can really help out there.
Huggins is 32 years old. He is definitely viewed as a guy on the ascent, and the guy you just had in that position role was coming off a head coach job, Stan Drayton, and he had already been running backs coach at some of the biggest programs in America. I think what I want to get to here with Huggins, aside from the fact that he is yet another example of a coach making the move to State College on the biggest stage that he's experienced in football, and also probably getting paid more than he's ever been paid to work in the game of football. This is a really exciting opportunity for a lot of these dudes, from Matt Campbell on down, to go from the resources where they have been working with personally and from an entire organizational standpoint at their previous campuses, for many of these guys, to where they are now in Happy Valley, the financial resources now that they have at their disposal, the amount of money that is hitting their bank account from their paycheck every couple of weeks. And so it's a really exciting time, I think, for a lot of these dudes. Whereas it got to the point, James Franklin, a dozen years into this thing, he was hiring mercenaries. I mean, he was hiring a lot of guys who had proved it on other campuses, guys who had already had big paydays. There were some examples of younger guys, lettermen like Deion Barnes and Ty Howell, but a lot of the hires here at Penn State were for dudes who have been more established, I think, in the profession in some regards than some of the additions we've seen here. And Tyler, from a player personnel perspective here, and going out and getting talent for the running back room and keeping running back talent on your roster, what do you make of Savon Huggins and that impact? Because when they hired Jaywan Sider a few, 7-8 years ago at this point, we knew that was going to open some doors in Florida. To me, it's very clear this is going to open doors in his native state of New Jersey. It's going to open doors throughout the Northeast, because at Boston College, you got to turn over a lot of rocks to find gems. And I think this is a guy who's going to be very well connected and well positioned with that Penn State logo now on his chest of his shirt to go make some noise in the recruiting trail for years to come.
No, guys. My Twitter mentions are telling me that since Boston College went 2-10 last year and his running backs didn't rush for 3,000 yards apiece, that it's the worst hire ever. So I don't really know what to make of this one. But no, in all seriousness, I think from a recruiting perspective, from a personnel perspective, I call it an A+ hire. I think from a recruiting perspective, on a couple different levels, that's how I would classify it. And here's why. Especially when it comes to the New Jersey stuff. New Jersey is a state Penn State wants to recruit really, really well. They haven't done that in a few years. I know the state's been down. There have been some questionable years in terms of talent coming out of New Jersey, but it's still a state Penn State wants to recruit well. This is a new staff. They just don't have a ton of familiarity in the Garden State. Matt Campbell and his staff, they've gone to New Jersey a few times and gotten some guys. I mean, two of the guys who just came over from Iowa State were New Jersey natives. So there was a little bit of familiarity in the state, but Savon Huggins is beloved throughout New Jersey. And as you're working to build relationships throughout the state and throughout the Northeast as a whole, it helps to have a familiar face out on the trail for you, one who's respected, one who has a proven track record of development at the Power 4 level. So I think it's a huge hire in that regard. And he's done some pretty good work with Boston College running back. So it's not just, oh, he's an ace recruiter and there's nothing else to it. There's definitely a developmental angle of this that works in Penn State's favor. I think he'll be able to accomplish a lot more now that he's in a place like Penn State. I mean, that's not a slight at Boston College, it's just kind of the reality of the landscape that we're in. I mean, the Penn State brand is what it is. He has more resources to work with now in the NIL rev share era. Penn State, deeper pockets, obviously, more to work with on the trail, more to sell on the trail. So we'll see what Savon Huggins is able to accomplish right off the bat if the returns are early in the 27 class, because everyone likes to circle, come on, spell, right in Penn State's backyard. Are the Nittany Lions going to be able to get back in the mix with him? I wouldn't necessarily say it's an early litmus test for Savon Huggins because there are some things working against him. I mean, the two really don't have a relationship. They don't know each other. But how will Huggins fare in high-level recruitments like that with the Penn State logo on his chest as opposed to the Boston College logo? There were plenty of people throughout my time with Savon at BC when he was on the staff there. I don't think it was that long before I came over and joined you guys. I think it was just a few months. But in talking to people, high school coaches throughout the Northeast, New Jersey, there was always a feeling with how impactful he was as a Boston College recruiter. You put a bigger brand behind him, he'd be able to go out and secure you some wins. So I'm very intrigued to see where this one's going to go for Penn State. I love the hire. It's one of my favorite assistant coach hires that Penn State has put together this cycle. I think it has a chance to pay real dividends in the region.
Well, with this move, we now have a complete, again, position coach outlook for Penn State's 2026 staff. Go check out our tracker for that at lions247.com. We'll probably get into that conversation at some point on the podcast as winter rolls on and kind of readdress a lot of those pickups for the staff. But for now, stepping aside from running back, where I mean, we knew it was going to be a bit of a reset with Nick Singleton and Katron Allen moving on and after the era they just had, but we didn't know quite this much of a reset when those guys would leave. A couple transfer portal players, a new running backs coach, and we'll see what else happens. And the in-town kid and Sheffy making his move as well. Picking it up on defense now, diving into that depth chart a bit and kind of looking through these position rooms. We got a lot to get to because the offensive conversation was busy earlier this week, and hopefully you caught that. The defensive one, I feel like, is just as busy, if not busier. We're going to start at defensive tackle, which is a really good example of all the movement we have seen so far. Before we talk about the transfer portal additions with Tyler Calvaruso, I want to begin with you, Daniel, in discussing who's in and who's out based on the 2025 roster. Xavier Gilliam is gone. He is committed to Tennessee, reuniting with Jim Knowles down there in Knoxville. Randy Adarica, a true freshman that took a red shirt that I think we were all pretty high on for his long-term potential. He has entered the transfer portal. And then staying here in State College for 2026, being retained, you got redshirt sophomore Ty Blanding, who played quite a bit of football for this team, played more in that bowl game with some guys missing. DeAndre Cook, another young piece, talking long-term there. And then Liam Andrews, who was one of the premier prospects of their 2024 class, missed that entire season because he was recovering from an injury, played very briefly at defensive tackle in some Big Ten matchups and in the bowl game. And so that is what we're left with to sort through. We knew Alonzo Ford and Zane Durant were moving on as they had senior eligibility. But Daniel, when you talk about the net results here of who's leaving, who's staying, how do you sort through it at DT?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Xavier Gilliam departure was a tough one for Penn State. That's a young player whose arrow is pointing up. I think he finished his redshirt freshman season. Played a lot of football. Alonzo Ford was the nominal starter for, I think you had in your story, like 11 of 12 games during the regular season. But Xavier Gilliam ultimately outsnapped him. I think he made 2 starts, appeared in all 13 games, played 409 snaps. And flashed. Like, I think that he was someone where you saw that he took steps forward. from being a true freshman. We know that he was someone who needed some physical development. Former basketball player down in Maryland who made the move to football and ultimately to the interior of the defensive line. And he did some nice things. And so, I think that there was some reporting from our Chris Hummer when Gilliam entered the portal that there was the chance that Penn State could contend for him, but also the market for defensive linemen, defensive tackles. That's prices can go up pretty quickly, I think. And so Gilliam ultimately lands in the SEC. Randy Adarica. Well, one thing with Gilliam, be curious if other guys join him there, with Jim Knowles and Anthony Poindexter. I think that'll be something to keep an eye on for Penn State fans.
They've had a few visitors. They've had a few visitors this week. Amari Campbell and Dejon Lane both expected on campus. Spoiler alert: Dejon Lane has entered the portal. We'll get to that a little bit later. But yeah, it seems like Jim Knowles, Anthony Poindexter down in Tennessee, maybe trying to get some of the band back together from that 2025 Nittany Lions defense.
Yeah, so we'll see with that. That'll be a fun storyline to follow, I think. Adarica, we heard really good things with him in the spring in terms of coming up from Florida, getting in the strength program. I think Zane Durant called him Big Randy. But defensive tackle, interior defensive line, like that's the position that unless you're special, we're probably not going to see you right away. So that was more of a 26, 27, 28 type of player. So we'll see where he lands. I mean, highly touted prospect. I think took some nice strides at Penn State. That'll be elsewhere. As for the retentions, I think in order to really get the full picture, you have to marry them with what's incoming because, with these three guys so far, it's not that many snaps. Ty Blanding, played the most. He's in that Zane Durant mold. I think that we liked what we saw from him in different moments. I think he was one of the stars of the blue-white game last April, but he was a little bit further down in that rotation when you factor in some of those veterans and Gilliam taking steps forward. I mean, Cook, haven't seen much of him. That's just the nature of the beast. And Andrews, I think we're all very intrigued by him, and he remains, kind of a fascination because he was someone that we were really high on in the recruiting process. And you look at him physically, and you can see how he could be a very disruptive player on that interior because he's a big guy, he's tall, he's long. I think that you can see him creating some havoc there. I think getting through a year healthy, I think that's big for him. He was the fringiest defensive tackle with the varsity. He would be with that varsity group every week at practice with Deion Barnes, but he was always in a scout team uniform. So he was kind of straddling that D squad varsity line for Penn State. I think that he's someone that could be fun to monitor as you move forward, especially with his body type, what he can do. Maybe you pair him with some of these big guys that are coming in. Maybe there is something there. But we'll see. I think with these guys that are coming back, how much they'll play, what kind of impact they can actually make.
Yeah, and so when Ty Blanding is pretty much by far your most experienced defensive tackle, you're going to have some influx of college veterans via the transfer portal, and they have hit defensive tackle hard in the last week or so. And Tyler, two of these names we addressed earlier in the week, but we can pick back up on them and then tack on another pair who committed on Tuesday. Got two out of UCLA, Keanu Williams, who was an early week commitment, and then a Thursday pickup was Siali Taupaki. And I'm pronouncing this for the first time. We did some research on the pronunciations. Hopefully we got it right. We got some Polynesian names to get a little bit more acclimated to here with Penn State's 2026 roster. Dallas Vakalahi, let me get this right. Dallas Vakalahi from Utah was a Thursday pickup, Vakalahi. And then Armstrong Nodem was an early week pickup from Oklahoma State. And so four things, these guys have some in common. They're both coming from far beyond the region, one at Oklahoma State, one at Utah, two at UCLA. The other thing they have in common is they're going to tip the scales in a way that we haven't really seen defensive tackles do in State College for the majority of the time I have covered this team. There haven't been a lot of guys at defensive tackle who are 320 plus pounds. All of a sudden, there's going to be a collection of them. Tyler, what do we need to know about these dudes and the updated mold of what Penn State wants from a DT moving forward?
Big dudes who could eat up gaps, eat up opposing offensive linemen, eat up blocks, free things up for the linebackers to fly through those gaps. You're seeing it with the size of some of these guys. I mean, they're just massive. A lot of them fit the run stuffing defensive tackle mold. That doesn't mean they're not athletic and can't get off the ball and make plays against the run in the opposing backfield, but their specialty is going to be clogging up those holes, eating up blocks, eating up gaps, and letting the linebackers fly downhill, get them the second level, make plays. That's how Deontay Lynn wants to play. That's how Penn State wants to build its defensive front. That's what they want to accomplish in the trenches. So I've seen some questions about, these guys are coming over from run defenses that weren't necessarily the best. But when you're evaluating transfer portal takes, you have to evaluate the individual as opposed to the unit that they're coming from. The unit does not tell the story of the individual that is coming over in the portal. With the two UCLA guys, Williams and Taupaki, I mean, they've got scheme familiarity more than any other portal addition coming over that's not from Iowa State. They know exactly what Deontay Lynn wants to run up front, and they know what their role is going to be. Same deal with Vakalali. I know he's not a UCLA guy coming over from Utah, but he has the exact kind of skill set that plays against the run. And then Nodum, I mean, first of all, I got to say, I'm glad I got his name right last week before we did the research on pronunciation. So give myself a pat on the back there. But he's going to be that 5 tech kind of guy. I mean, he's a freak. It's like what I said last week. Freak, strong, athletic. He's kind of different than the rest of these D tackles in that sense, right? He has the size at 290, but he's not tipping the scales at 300 plus. He's a strong, thick kid. And his best football, and you talk to people at Penn State, you talk to people at Oklahoma State who are familiar with Armstrong Nodum, they think his ceiling is going to be extremely high as he gets to work with the Nittany Lions staff. There is a lot of optimism about his future at the Power 4 level. So, D tackle, the room has kind of went through a complete makeover at this point. And right now, the question is that makeover going to be for the better compared to the pieces that Penn State has lost in the portal or lost, whatever it may be, the guys who are not going to be back next year? These players that Penn State has brought in, they're vets. They're going to get right down to business. And I think bringing in guys, Williams, Taupaki, I mean, the scheme familiarity, I come back to it. It's going to help them hit the ground running once spring ball arrives. I don't think it's going to be a long acclimation process, and that's big as Penn State works to rework things on the defensive side of the ball. So I think all of these defensive tackle takes that we've seen so far have a place in Penn State's picture for what they're building. And look, guys, I know the number's a big one at the position in terms of what they've taken so far, but they might not be done. They might take one more.
And their new defensive line coach, this may have been lost in the shuffle with all the news that we've been trying to track down on these podcasts during the last couple of weeks. But Ikaike Malloy came over, former UCLA defensive coordinator. He is now the defensive line coach for Penn State, going to be working with Deontay Lynn once again. Those two actually collaborated for USC. Or at UCLA in 2023 when Lynn was the defensive coordinator. He was defensive line coach. Then Malloy replaced Lynn as defensive coordinator at UCLA. When they changed up things with their coaching staff this season, he stepped aside from that situation. Now he resurfaces here, and he's a guy that, we're seeing it a little bit here, Tyler, the Polynesian influence here. And is this something that's going to be a new dynamic for Penn State on the recruiting trail and the transfer portal, where this could be a bit of an interesting cultural dynamic in this roster, in this locker room? We were anticipating that, about a month ago when we thought Satake from BYU was going to take this job, because that's been a big part of what he has done at BYU. Is this an aspect of Malloy's arsenal that you think could maybe be compelling for Penn State's roster building down the road? And
I actually do, because I don't think it goes beyond just these guys who are coming over mainly because, of the familiarity that I mentioned. But if you look, I mean, Dallas Vakalai has a younger brother who got an offer. He's a 2029 linebacker. They just went out to Hawaii to offer a top 100 linebacker, Tau Satelli. He's the son of former NFL player Samson Satelli. These are offers that you didn't see all that often from the previous staff. The previous staff put one out in Hawaii a few years ago. His name's escaping me, but I'm pretty sure he plays a prominent role in Oregon's offensive line now. So those guys could play. There's no doubt about it. They're tough, physical, nasty, tireless workers. So there's a lot to like from a cultural perspective of what those guys bring to the table. And I do think it has the potential to be more of a, I wouldn't want to say a philosophy in the Penn State recruiting world, because there's more that goes into it than just, oh, he's, a Samoan kind of guy, we're going to go get him. But I do think that's a realm where Penn State could operate in a little bit more now, because Malloy is very respected on the West Coast. He's got a lot of good relationships, and they know what they're getting in him. And I don't mean that from an on-field coaching perspective either. It's like what I've said about Terry Smith over the years, where when guys go to play for him, they know they're going to be taken care of, and the high school coaches know they're going to be taken care of, so that they got no problem sending their kid to go play for that coach. Malloy falls into a similar realm. So it could definitely become a increased part of what Penn State wants to do on the trail.
One of those guys coming over from UCLA with him, and Sayali Taupaki, he is an 8th-year college player. I just wanted to make sure we address that. He is a class of 2019. I know he has a medical red shirt, a regular red shirt, the COVID red shirt. I believe he picked up a waiver for another year. We were talking about Zariah Fisher playing his 7th season here, and he's going to actually do it at USC. You got an 8th-year college player. Interesting stuff. We got to sort through this defensive tackle group in the months to come. A lot to unpack with the entire group, and we'll see if it grows anymore. Over at defensive end, before we even got to the Pinstripe Bowl, there were some significant departures. Chaz Coleman, a very promising freshman. He's had a lot of interest in the transfer portal, visits to LSU, Tennessee, Ohio State in the last week or so. Zariah Fisher, as I just said, he's going to finish off his career at USC. He started for Penn State here as a 6th-year senior. Then younger pieces of this roster have also moved on at the edge rusher spot. Malachi Williams, Cortez Harris, Daniel Jennings. Jennings has already resurfaced with Virginia Tech. Then you look at guys who have announced that they are staying put. You've got Yvonne Kamaju, who finished the season on a high note, was one of the more important roster retention pieces, we thought, on the defensive side of the football, given what you're losing at defensive end and given what he showed as a true freshman. Max Granville, not to be forgotten, he's going to be in his 3rd year technically at the college level in 2026, but remember, he reclassified late to get on campus in 2024, played a bit, then was injured early in 2025, and we thought he was going to be a breakout piece of the defense. So he's around as a redshirt sophomore. And then Mason Robinson, who has been really banged up for much of his career, another player who we think of as young, but he's now right around the halfway point of his college eligibility, has also put it out that he's there. Robinson, it's hard to call him anything but a non-factor on the defense thus far through his career, because that's just how it has gone. Granville has been more of an intriguing prospect to this point. Kamaju has shown it through his 1st year on campus. But Daniel, there is a lot of change happening, not to mention Deion Barnes, the guy who assembled this group in a lot of ways, has moved on. He's now South Carolina on their staff. And so before we get to the transfer portal conversation about who's coming in, who might be coming in, what do you think about how things have gone here over the last 5 weeks or so as Penn State has prepared for the Pinstripe Bowl and then moved on for the Pinstripe Bowl?
I think you look at the retentions here with Yvonne Kamaju and Max Granville, and I think that's your headline there. I know Chaz Coleman leaving is, the flashier thing, especially with where he could potentially end up and the finances involved there, everything along those lines. But I do think that getting Kamaju and Granville to come back in the wake of that, I think that that's really significant because Kamaju, I thought, came on really strong over the course of the year. They decided to burn his red shirt, and he saw his playing time go up. I think you could make the case that maybe he's a higher floor player this year than Coleman was, just in terms of their skill sets. I still think that Chaz Coleman's ceiling is through the roof, but Kamaju, they were able to play him in every game they played down the stretch. Granville, I think he's someone we really want to see back on the field. We want to see what kind of steps he can take forward. I think, like you said, we all had him penciled in as the breakout guy in 2025 in terms of what he could do off the edge, and especially in the context of Penn State trying to replace Abdul Carter last year. I do think that you can make the case that Denai Dennis-Sutton, very, very good player, but they lacked someone who could really make those splash plays on a consistent basis. I think we thought that Granville might be able to do that. And I think one thing too is that those guys are both young. Kamaju will be a sophomore. Granville will be a redshirt sophomore. Who knows if he'll have an extra year available to him because of his injury. But you look at the guys who left. I mean, you mentioned Zariah Fisher, 7th-year guy, but Coleman, Williams, Harris, Jennings, those are 1st and 2nd-year guys. And so, as you I think look at things moving forward. How are you going to restock the cupboard? How are you going to build this position to have sustainable depth? I think getting young guys to come back and bringing in a younger guy as your first addition at the spot, I think that stands out to me as you think of not only how can you compete in 2026, but how are you going to be able to position yourself in 27, 28 to keep developing guys to, get it going so that you don't have to go to the portal every year to reload and you're not losing a bunch of guys to the portal every year. I think that really stands out to me as well.
A reminder that last year, before Granville suffered his injury, which came after spring ball, I think it was in May, sometime around that, away from the team, he was referred to as Chop 2.0 by Denai Dennis Sutton. And Denai was not the only person in team facilities to bring up that Chop Robinson comparison. We know how it worked out for Robinson here, an all Big Ten player, a first-round NFL draft pick. And so we'll see once Max Granville gets back into pads and starts moving around on the practice field again and beating offensive tackles, what we begin to hear about him as he makes his return to action. But going to be a key component. And Tyler, I think it's very obvious that if you're sorting through defense right now and you're looking for areas that need to be addressed and maybe with some high-level starting quality talent, defensive end stands out because we've become accustomed here to there being NFL-type talents rushing from the perimeter for Penn State. You look at Chop Robinson, Abdul Carter, and Denai Dennis Sutton most recently, and all due respect to the potential of everyone in this room, especially Yvonne Kamaju as a rising sophomore now, no one has really shown that they can dominate the edge thus far. And that wasn't going to be the case if Zariah Fisher stayed with you either. Do they have the ability to go find someone like that in the transfer portal? And tell us a little bit more about the guy they have picked up there, Alexander McPherson. He was a freshman last year at Colorado, flashed at times playing a bit in year one, former IMG Academy player down in Florida. That's a national powerhouse that he spent time with for years. I really like his prospect profile. Can you tell us more on that? But to me, he is not the answer when you're talking about plug and play game 1 2026. Maybe I'm wrong, but to me, there's certainly room here if they have the ability to go spend some money to bring in somebody.
My stance on McPherson when it comes to potential instant impact, he could be a guy in your rotation right away in 26, but as the year goes on, he gets a lot better and plays more and more of a prominent role once we reach Big Ten play. There's a lot of potential there. He had a good first year at Colorado, but they're not stopping at Alexander McPherson. They love him, but they're not stopping there on the edge. They're still scouring the market for top-tier talent. I know Anto Saka, when he hit the portal from Northwestern, he immediately raised a lot of eyebrows, especially when he went in with the do not contact tag. A lot of people thought Penn State was going to be involved there. He's off the board to Texas A&M. There was interest, but once Saka made it to A&M, it was kind of a done deal. Aggies were able to get that one done in short order. So they're still working on the edge. I would anticipate some more visits from edge rusher targets. I would anticipate some more edge rusher additions in this portal haul when it's all said and done. They like what's in the room, but they want to keep adding. A guy like McPherson's a great start, don't get me wrong, but I think there's a consensus that more is needed.
Let's talk about linebacker, and edge rusher will be a spot that we discuss on the message board and here on the podcast moving forward. I think that's an area where you're going to continue to see work being done by this staff. But over at linebacker, there's been a lot of work done. There's been some key losses in terms of depth in the starting lineup. And Daniel Amari Campbell obviously is one of the headline departures from this transfer portal window for Penn State. He's a guy that we viewed, if you can get him and Tony Rojas back together, that's a big start for your defense under new leadership. Of course, we actually thought that Campbell was earlier in the process probably more likely to come back than Tony Rojas. It ends up being flipped. Rojas is staying here in State College. Amari Campbell is out and about in the transfer portal. We hear he's going to be at Tennessee on this Friday. But Keon Wiley, who was essentially your third or fourth linebacker for much of Big Ten action, he has left. He is going to Virginia Tech. Dakari Nelson, a transitioned safety who was really a special teams contributor, not much of a defensive piece, has moved on. And then Anthony Specca and Kari Jackson, the two linebackers who signed in the 2024 class, have also moved on. You have kept Tony Rojas, as we said. He's a guy that will be his third season as a starting player for you. Obviously, he was limited to the first 4 games last year before an injury that he suffered on the practice field. And then a younger ranking member of the room, Alex Tash, was among the early guys who confirmed his roster retention. When we talk about retention, by the way, we're not just going through everybody. We're going through guys that have actually publicly put it out there in some way or another. So when it comes to Cam Smith, when it comes to LeVar Arrington II, I don't necessarily have concerns that they're leaving, but we just haven't seen them go out there and put out a public statement that they're staying with the team. And that's what we're basing a lot of this retention on right now. So Daniel,
I think that you,
go ahead.
No, yeah. I mean, I think that from what you said in terms of retention, I mean, it just starts with Tony Rojas. I think that what he gives you on the field athletically and also as a leader in that locker room, I think that is a great place to start if you're Matt Campbell. And I think it also shows that, Tony Rojas, that, this means something to him. This is where, he wants to make an impact. Alex Tash, I think that given that he was hurt during bowl prep, we'll see, where he is. I think that was one of the more, it always stinks when someone gets hurt, but I think that one was pretty disappointing to hear, given the timing, given where his trajectory was, and where things were going there. As for the guys who left, I mean, the Campbell one, I think, does hurt. I think that when you compare him physically to which Iowa State guys are coming in, he's a little bit on the smaller side. He's a different profile than what it looks like Matt Campbell and his staff were recruiting to Iowa State, which is a little interesting to me. But I think that you saw last year that Campbell is one of those guys that, he's a gamer. He is, whatever quote unquote physical deficiencies he might have, he has the mindset, he has the mental side of the game to make up for that. And also, like, he plays hard. I think that was, over the course of the year, him throwing his body around, him, laying out some of those hits despite just being 6 foot 230. I think that stood out to me. Other guys who are leaving. I mean, Wiley, you hope that he can get into a role where he can, use that pass rushing juice that we heard so much about. In my head, I was trying to go back. I was like, he did commit to Brent Pry. All the way back in the day, I'm pretty sure. So you got some familiarity there. And then Nelson, maybe he can find a place and a home where it can come together with him. I think that he's one of those guys where on paper, just his measurements, his length, his athleticism. I know that when he was coming out down in Selma, Alabama, he was playing in one of those all-star games after his high school career ended. And the feedback from our 24/7 sports staff was just like, this is the guy. Like, this is a stud right here. It's unfortunate that it never came together. And then I think with Specca and Jackson, I know Jackson had the injury issues. And then, I think that those are guys that when they came into the program, the different transitions, I think that, a lot of these guys from that class, you just get kind of caught in the wash a little bit. Specca's headed to Purdue. He'll get a chance there. We'll see where Jackson ends up. We heard a lot about his physicality. Hopefully he can stay healthy enough where he can show it.
Anthony Specca at Purdue, Zariah Fisher at USC, both on Penn State's schedule for 2026 in Big Ten action. And Tyler, I mean, it has been the Iowa State show in terms of who's coming in at linebacker. They have gone to what they know in Ames, bringing in 3 guys thus far: Caleb Bacon, Cale Brazina, and then Cooper Ebel. And these guys were pretty productive last year for Iowa State. Ebel was the leading tackler for the Cyclones, 77 of them, including 8 for losses. And then Caleb Bacon, right around 70 tackles on the season as well, 3 sacks for Iowa State. And then a little bit further down the stats list for Iowa State, you will find Brazina, 29 tackles on the season. So 3 guys that have played a lot of football for this staff. Former Iowa State linebackers coach turned Cincinnati defensive coordinator, turned Penn State linebackers coach now, Tyson Veit, is on campus. And so he has familiarity with these 3. And oh, by the way, Dan Connor remains a figure of this staff. He'll be working with the linebacker unit as well, but it's going to be Veit who leads the way in that position group now. So Tyler, what stands out about these guys physically, production wise, and why do you think that Iowa State seemingly was comfortable and maybe not paying what Amari Campbell wanted and turning back to Iowa State and saying, fellas, come on board, because this has been a really interesting dynamic to emerge through the first week of the transfer portal window.
I think you look at the body type on all three of those guys, and it probably gives you your answer on why Penn State was more willing to bring them in than pay Amari Campbell what he was looking for. I mean, Amari Campbell, we know he was a little bit on the shorter side for a linebacker. There's nothing wrong with that because he was a productive player. But Ebel, Bacon, Brazina, I mean, they're just kind of like tanks at the linebacker position. They're not built in that athletic, dropping the coverage sideline to sideline mold that we became accustomed to with the previous staff. These guys, they're big cats. I mean,
Tony
Bacon,
Rojas has that covered, right? Tony Rojas says the sideline to sideline position covered pretty well, as long as he's available for you.
Exactly. And even he is a little bit bigger than some of the other guys we've seen in recent Penn State linebacking cores. This group coming over from Iowa State, they're thumpers. They're strong against the run. I've got to do a little bit more research on how some of these guys are in coverage, to be completely honest with you, because that's an aspect that obviously you need out of the linebacker position, regardless of what kind of a system you're running. And it's going to be part of the Anton Lynn system. You need these guys to spot drop in the zone sometimes and get the job done in that realm. But just going by guy, Ebel's a really underrated player. You talk to people out in the Big 12, they like what he does against the run. Bacon he's the highest ranked linebacker of the three in the portal on our end, top 100 player in the portal, number 3 linebacker. Not quite sure he's the top 100 player in the portal, but it's a good ranking for him. He's been productive throughout his career at Iowa State. 2025, he came back from an injury that cost him the 2024 season, so it was nice to see him back out on the field and producing at a pretty high clip as Iowa State's third leading tackler with 68 on the year. Former walk-on, so yeah, look, we've got a Dom DeLuca of sorts on the roster, but Bacon's a different kind of player. Don't get it twisted. And Brazina, he's battled some injuries throughout his career early at Iowa State, but that's another young linebacker where the staff really likes the upside, and he's played a pretty prominent role in that linebacker rotation when healthy. So don't write him off. He's the younger of the three. He is the less established of the three, but I think, and in talking to people who have been around him, he's just as talented as the three. So it's a productive trio. It's a welcome trio in State College. And again, I talked about with the defensive lineman, I think each of these pieces as an individual, they fit what Penn State's trying to do defensively.
Big year for this linebacker room because there's a lot of moving parts. Tony Rojas has really sky-high expectations as a senior, and we'll learn a lot about this group under Coach Veit in the months ahead. Look forward to getting to know him and getting to know some of these new Iowa State transplants as we have a lot to learn about this team generally, but linebacker room is one I'm particularly curious about. We'll finish this conversation, this breakdown in the defensive backfield, and we'll go with one position to begin where there has been a lot of turnover and another where there has been less. And you're probably feeling a little bit better about things as they stand here on January 9th, 2026. But at safety, that's an area where you've seen a bunch of movement. King Mack was somebody that we really anticipated to be in this Nittany Lions uniform. We're leaning that direction. It certainly sounded like he was leaning in that direction during some conversations ahead of the Pinstripe Bowl. He played a ton in the Pinstripe Bowl, but ultimately he ends up hitting the transfer portal. He is going to NC State. So 3 consecutive off seasons now where King Mack will change programs. Of course, one of them involved him coming back to Penn State for a second stint, but he's off to the ACC now. And then you've got Dejan Lane, a guy who actually put it out there, like Tyseer Denmark, that he was a guy who's going to be sticking around. He didn't do the I am coming back to Penn State in 2026 announcement, but he did an announcement with a photo and a caption that led you to believe, okay, Lane's back in the fold. Instead, he hits the transfer portal. He's another guy that we've heard is visiting Tennessee to check in with Poindexter and Jim Knowles. Antoine Belgrave Shorter hits the transfer portal like his former high school teammate John Mitchell did earlier in the process. 2 guys that came up together from Mandarin High School in Florida. Lamont Payne is in the portal, and so is Braz Thomas, a couple young players that we didn't really get a chance to see in game action. And then the one name that we have to point to here who has been retained is Vabu Torre. I thought he played very well for himself in the game against Clemson. Quite frankly, whenever I see Torre, including these spring games, I come away impressed with the way he goes downhill, with the kind of intimidating element that he provides in a secondary. And that was really the word on him coming out of high school in New Jersey. And so Daniel, this is a spot where you take Anthony Poindexter out of the equation as well. You've now got a new position coach in Deion Broomfield, who was out at Iowa State with Matt Campbell for a while. And you've got new leadership on the field, off the field. This is a spot where, as Tyler Cavaruso will get to, they're adding veteran talent, but it's a pretty significant overhaul for a group that we have pretty much been able to hang our hat on year in, year out under Anthony Poindexter.
I think when you look at the Penn State safety group, I think that it's the position that is experiencing the biggest reset on the roster when you factor in who is supposed to come back. I know offensive line, that's going to be a huge reset, but you had 3 guys in their last year of eligibility, plus Venga Ioane, who was probably going to leave too. Like, there are other positions where you're doing a reset, but that's because you had a bunch of seniors who were going to move on the way the roster is constructed. Safety is the one where I think you have the biggest brain drain in terms of guys who are leaving, who you expected to be back, like we thought King Mack would be, like Dejon Lane indicated he could be, and then a guy in Antoine Belgrave Shorter, who had eligibility remaining, did play a lot of football, got valuable reps last year, and is also moving on. So I think that this is really going to be a total reset. We talked about how they played a top 4 last year. All those guys are gone. 3 to the portal, Zachy Wheatley to the NFL. And it's going to be interesting how this really comes together. I know that Tyler can talk more about it, but I know Marcus Neal Jr. Is a really, really significant addition from Iowa State on the back end. You've got a couple other former Cyclones coming over too. But I think that this is a position that is going to be really interesting to watch. I think also, you factor in what does this look like in Danton Lynn's defense, maybe marrying what Deion Broomfield was coaching at Iowa State in that 3-3-5 stack, with how Lynn ran things at USC, at UCLA. I think that that's going to be an interesting marriage to see how that mix comes together and what that means for some of these safeties. But I think overall, this is a position that is going to look, I think, the most different going into 2026 based on what you might have expected it to look like when the season ended.
I mentioned a little while ago that Cooper Ebel, the linebacker, led Iowa State in tackles. He actually tied for the team lead with Marcus Neal Jr., who Daniel referenced there, 77 tackles. He led Iowa State from the safety position with tackles for loss, 11 of those. And then you bring in another accomplished safety from Iowa State in Jamison Patton. Only played in 9 games last season, but he was right around 50 tackles. He had 2 interceptions. That's the same interception total that Neal had. So you've got 2 really experienced safeties coming in from Ames. Additionally, another one in Hunter Sowell. His older brother, Noah, is the wide receiver we spent a lot of time talking about earlier in the week. A lot of excitement about what he can bring to the receiver spot, but that's a tandem of brothers that are coming into your program now, one at safety, and then a 4th pickup in the transfer portal at this spot. Which I believe ties the defensive tackle position for the most of any position pickup so far through this week. Omarion Davis, another Boston College addition. So you got a couple of them here to talk about Tyler Cavaruso. We got a running backs coach from Boston College. We got a safety coming in from Boston College. What do we need to know about this quartet of safeties? And do you think that they've potentially got their 2 starters from this group? Because when you look at their top 4 safeties from last season, they're all gone. 3 guys shared that second starting job: King Mack, Antoine Belgrave Shorter, Dejon Lane. I think we thought at least one of them would be here to at least make a strong case to stick in the starting lineup. Now that's kind of vanished before our eyes. Does it end up being 2 Iowa State players in the back end, you think?
Certainly possible. I mean, Neal's going to start. Let's just call that one what it is now. I mean, he might be, I don't know, when ranking some of these Iowa State portal additions, just in my head, I haven't written an article about it or anything. Marcus Neal might be, he has a case to be number 2 on the list behind Rocco Beck. I know I've raved about Benjamin Brahmer at tight end, but man, Marcus Neal is, he's such a good player. I mean, you go watch his film, he does everything. He hits, he's great in coverage. I mean, high level safety who has coming off a very nice breakout season working with Deion Broomfield. He gets to continue his development working with Broomfield at Penn State. He's going to be a crucial part of the back end of Penn State's secondary in 2025, barring injury, or 2026, barring injury. There's no doubt about it. He's that kind of player. You can lock him in right now. I think Jamison Patton is probably going to be lining up next to him as well when it's all said and done. Productive at Iowa State, battled injuries from time to time, but he's a veteran. He knows Deion Broomfield well, knows what expecting out of him on the day-to-day as a safety playing under Broomfield. So there's a lot to like. Those two coming over from Iowa State. I'm a big fan of Amarian Davis as well, and talking to some people in Chestnut Hill who had the chance to spend some time with him throughout his true freshman season at Boston College. They think there's a lot there to mold. He's a guy they did not want to lose to the transfer portal. They wanted to keep Amarian Davis around. You look at Amarian Davis and you evaluate him. I'm not sure what he's going to be in 2026 necessarily. I still think there's some developing to do, but he has the tools to develop quicker working with a guy like Broomfield who has that proven track record on the developmental front. So we'll see. He'll be part of that rotation for sure, and he's an intriguing part of the rotation. And Hunter Sewell, obviously, he's coming over from Iowa State as well, younger brother of Chase Sewell. I'm hearing that's more of like a walk-on kind of deal. I'm not expecting him to count towards the scholarship numbers right now, but he is another young piece in that room. And they're also, again, they're not done at safety either. They're still looking. Carmelo O'Neal from Mercer, highly touted FCS transfer at safety, has a lot of SEC suitors. I think it's going to be a pretty tough pull for Penn State because it's a deep pool of schools in on him. But Nittany Lions are trying, so they're not done at the position. And Jamari Cooper, too, from Iowa State. His recruitment in the portal has been surprisingly quiet for a player as talented as him. He offers you positional versatility, safety. He can play corner, so he can fit in a couple different spots. That's what makes him an intriguing target for Penn State. We'll see where things ultimately go there. Cooper, from our understanding, has not been to campus yet for a visit. One could surface soon, though. I think it's in the works.
Yeah, I mistakenly referred to Sewell's older brother as Noah, and that's going back to a former All Pac-12 player at Oregon.
Yeah,
but no, his name is Chase, and we're going to get to know his name quite well because he could be one of the premier playmakers in this offense for Penn State coming over from Iowa State. And let's note, I'm really curious about what this all means for Vabu Torre and what he can do with this opportunity, because we're talking about a former Iowa State safeties coach with two guys that he has seen play a lot of football and seen do a lot in the practice field. Then you've got a guy they targeted out of Boston College coming in with some experience. But Torre is a guy that's going to be in year 3 at this level. I really liked him as a prospect coming out of New Jersey because, again, he's got that intimidating presence that I think you can really thrive off of as long as you can balance with pass coverage and all the other stuff. Torre is a guy that I think we should not discount when we're talking about the starting lineup, and certainly when you're talking about coming up with a top 3 or 4 plan at safety. We'll see what else they can do in the portal there. We're going to close things out at cornerback, where things are a lot more neat and tidy at this point. The biggest departure for this room, in fact, the 2 biggest departures for this room, were both out of the way before this team kicked off in the Pinstripe Bowl. A.J. Harris, a 2-year starter who transferred in from Georgia in 2024. He is back in the transfer portal. He's going to finish his college career somewhere else. Elliott Washington, who did not play against Clemson, will play for Clemson next year. He will be a senior. He was never quite a full-time starter here with Penn State, but for a couple years here was in that top 4 to 5 conversation at a position group where they do go pretty deep on a regular basis. And so those guys are gone. Kenny Wosley has since joined them. He was the primary backup in the nickel position. Now he's looking for a different option as a 3rd-year college player. And then retained for this group, this is a really nice retention list. I think this is probably about as good as you'll find across the roster for any position. Audavian Collins coming off of a really strong starting season. He'll be a senior. You've got Zion Tracy, who's played a ton of football for you at this point. I think he probably has more collective special teams and defensive or offensive snaps than anybody in a Nittany Lions uniform on this roster. He will be locking down that nickel position, we'd imagine. Darius Dixon, standout freshman, started a couple games with A.J. Harris off the field, including the Pinstripe Bowl. Really impressed during that 4-game win streak. And then fellow freshman Jameer Joseph, who I believe we discussed last Friday when Tyler came on to talk about some of the early transfer portal movement, because him and Dixon came off pretty quick in saying, we're staying here, we're not going in the portal. And so you've got a really nice duo there with Joseph being a redshirt freshman, Dixon being a sophomore, of guys who have certainly flashed at times in games, Dixon more so, but both of them give you something to build upon. And then Tracy and Collins have established themselves as starters. And Daniel, before we talk to Tyler about what may join them in that room ultimately, again, I think this is a group where when you forecasted where it could have been in mid-December, they're in a pretty damn good spot. And we have to acknowledge the fact that Terry Smith is leading that room again, which helps with this entire process for the roster. But you're going to really feel that in the cornerback room where he's going to be a 13th year position coach for Penn State.
I was going to say that that's the biggest piece of retention for Penn State is Terry Smith coming back, and then we got clarity that he will be the cornerbacks coach again next year. The cornerback room is pretty much the inverse of the safety room in terms of where we would be sitting in late November and expecting what would be coming back. I know that Harris and Washington, they are losses. Woolsey is a loss, especially when it comes to depth. Those are three guys that played a lot of football for you. Washington was a really key special teams player. You can quibble about the level that AJ Harris played at last season, but he's a talented guy. And anytime you take that type of player out of a group, it hurts a little bit. But I think coming back, I mean, I feel like this might be the one position outside of maybe Rocco Becht at quarterback where we can sit right now and sort of fill in the depth chart already. Collins, Dixon on the outside, Tracy in the slot. Like that you feel pretty good about that. Not only in terms of projection, but also just what you expect to see on the field. These guys are all, I think, Collins and Tracy in particular are proven. Dixon is high upside. And then Joseph is someone where I feel like there was a little bit of a conversation last year of could he move into that green light category? Was he someone that was going to make a move? I think early in the season, they showed some alignments where he was working in the slot as sort of a bigger slot corner behind Tracy and next to Woolsey. I thought that was a little bit of an interesting development, and I'm curious what his upside is. I know that Alan Zamitis, I remember being on that call on signing day and just the excitement that they had about Joseph coming out of New Jersey, what he had in his athletic background and what they felt that he could do. I think this quartet, it's a really strong start on the back end. You still play in the Big Ten. Ohio State isn't on the schedule this year, so you don't have to worry about Jeremiah Smith. But Indiana got Nick Marsh. There's other good wide receivers in this conference, and you got to be strong on the back end. This is a really good start for Matt Campbell.
They're trying to reset the standard in some ways in different position groups, but that's already in place. It's been long in place at cornerback. I know you're very high on the Terry Smith retention and the player retention that we just discussed, Tyler, but what's next at cornerback? Because this is an area where I know they're talking with transfer portal players, but it hasn't been as much smoke around particular pieces, especially guys that are going to kind of command some significant money from you. And maybe that makes sense given the starting talent and the young caliber that they have in place. But do you still expect some movement here when it's all said and done?
Yeah, and they're exploring. I mean, they've got a couple of FCS guys on campus for visits as we speak, and Seth Johnson from Montana State and D. Newsome from Samford. I feel like it's been a quieter transfer portal cycle for Terry Smith compared to some recent years. I feel like Terry's always pretty active in the portal, but we're a little bit later in the game. Well, this is going to be the second weekend of portal visits, and right now Johnson is one to watch for sure. He was a standout in that FCS title game against Illinois State that garnered a lot of headlines. He was a really good player for Montana State throughout the year. Newsome, really talented corner out of Samford, long kid, fast kid, so he fits the bill of what Terry Smith looks for out of the position. I do expect they'll probably get a guy at some point, but they're not gonna force the issue. No, I should probably talk about the most obvious one. Ibn McDaniels from Syracuse, he is a redshirt freshman. I blanked on what his eligibility status is looking like right now. 2 years at Syracuse, versatile kid. So year one at Q's, played some safety for Fran Brown. Year two, majority of his work came in the slot, in the nickel. So you can plug him in a couple different spots. I think that's part of the appeal. McDaniels is one we have circled very, very closely right now as a potential addition to this portal class.
He's got a crystal ball. He's got a crystal ball on him.
Yeah. And I'm probably going to pop one. Yeah, and I'm probably going to pop one in at some point here soon, too. I think it's definitely trending that way for Penn State. So when I say anticipated addition, I think McDaniels is probably the one who's closest on that front. And assuming he hops on board, where does that leave things? I think there's room for another addition as well. I think it's going to become dependent on fit. because we all know Terry Smith and how he recruits at this point. He ain't gonna force anything, right? He's gonna make sure it is the utmost perfect fit for his cornerback room. McDaniels fits that mold though. He's a really talented kid, New Jersey product, so he's from the footprint. He has Power 4 experience, and not just a kid who has Power 4 experience, but a kid who's eager to prove that he does indeed belong on the Power 4 level instead of transferring down to a group of five. Because he had plenty of group of five suitors. He's visited Temple. Connecticut was involved, but he wants to play Power 4 football. And Kentucky's been involved with McDaniels as well, but Penn State is the one to circle right now.
Good stuff, Tyler. And when you're talking about putting a crystal ball pick in, people pay attention to that. Tyler has been on the money with forecasting Penn State's transfer portal moves throughout this window. I expect that to continue for another week, although for everyone's sake, I hope it's a little less exciting the second week versus the first week of this transfer portal window. I mean, we're running out of guys on this roster to make announcements internally at least, but it has been something to follow here on the Penn State coverage beat. We hope you've been following our coverage beyond this podcast over at the site, where you're going to get day-to-day, minute-by-minute updates in these weeks ahead of us. And Brian Doan has been chiming in with a lot of stuff. Our 24/7 Sports Network has been jumping in. But Tyler Cavaruso, Daniel Gallen, myself, Mark Brennan will have you up to date on everything with this coaching staff, with the roster, as things continue to evolve. 50% off right now for VIP subscription at Lions247.com. I believe that is holding up that deal through the end of the transfer portal window. So hop on board with us and get on board for half the price for a full year. Guys, appreciate it. I know we went really long with this episode. Nature of the beast, I guess, though, with where we are in the calendar right now. Didn't want to leave much of this stuff out. So Tyler, Daniel, great work from you guys. Make sure you're following them on social media and at our website. For now, stepping aside, I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.